In winter-bright New York, a single knock breaks the hush of a Gramercy studio. A painter with steady hands meets a Wall Street heir with steady eyes. Two lives stitched by silence, divided by class. Between them, an unfinished canvas glows like a held breath. It sees too much. It knows the cost. Desire leans toward duty. Duty leans toward desire. One choice could spare a family name. Another might save a soul. And somewhere in the paint, a secret waits, ready to pull the past into the present and test the vow no one has spoken aloud. Tell us where you're listening from, and share. In historical romances, what do you crave most? Forbidden love, scandal, or redemption? New York City, winter of 1895. The light in the studio at Gramercy Park fell softly, filtered through linen curtains that had faded from cream to pearl grey with the passage of seasons. Snow whispered against the tall windows, blanketing the iron railings and bare branches outside in a hush that seemed to honour the silence within. Josephine Carr stood near the easel, brush in hand, her fingers stained with the pigments of oil and time. The scent of linseed, old wood, and melted beeswax lingered in the air, mingling with the faintest trace of rosewater from the faded ribbon that still adorned her mother's sewing chair in the corner. Her latest subject, a sugar heiress with a throat too stiff and a smile too thin, would not arrive until noon. For now, Josephine painted the shadows. She worked not with urgency, but with reverence, as if coaxing out a secret rather than imposing an image. Her strokes were deliberate, quiet. A canvas leaned against the wall behind her, half draped in muslin. She had learned to conceal more than she revealed, even in her own home. A knock at the studio door startled her. Not brusque, not familiar. 2 measured raps, no more. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the room, her shoes making a soft sound on the worn floorboards. When she opened the door, the cold rushed in before the man did. He was tall, the kind of tall that commanded space without asking for it. His coat was dark navy, cut sharply at the shoulder, and his leather gloves, glossy black, were still dusted with snow. His hat, a fine Homburg, he removed immediately. And then he spoke, not with arrogance, but with the calm tone of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Miss Carr," he said, "my name is Jasper Lockwood. Forgive the unannounced visit." His voice was low, polished, but not theatrical. She had heard it before. Men of the exchange spoke like that when they were not on the exchange. He looked around the studio briefly, then returned his gaze to her with polite restraint. His eyes, slate grey, did not wander. She motioned him inside. "It's warmer by the stove," she offered, her voice composed but alert. He stepped in, careful not to track snow, and removed his gloves with precision. There was something in the way he carried himself, not haughty, not stiff, but considered, as though every gesture were measured by some internal compass. He did not speak at once, allowing the silence to stretch a moment. In the stillness, Josephine could hear the ticking of the regulator clock on the mantel, the crackle of the iron stove, and, faintly, the sleigh bells from the avenue below. "I come with a request of a personal nature," he began. Standing by the chair she motioned toward, but not yet sitting. "My aunt, Eugenia Lockwood, has recently taken ill. She's a formidable woman, stubborn as a banker's will. She has refused every camera pointed her way since the invention of the daguerreotype. I hoped perhaps you might capture her likeness, discreetly, without fanfare. She trusts only hand and brush." Josephine studied him a moment before answering. "A private portrait," she said, more to herself than to him. "Not for exhibition." "No," he said quickly. "She would never allow it. It would remain in the family." She nodded, eyes narrowed just slightly in thought. When would she be willing to sit? He hesitated, then smiled, barely. "She won't sit, not consciously. I thought you might come to her for tea, pretend it's conversation, observe, sketch quietly. You seem attentive enough to manage that." It was the first moment he allowed himself a softness, not flirtation, not charm, just quiet acknowledgement. Josephine's eyes lifted to meet his. There was a flicker there, something unspoken but understood. She had painted generals, widows, daughters, and diplomats, but rarely had a client placed such deliberate trust in her observation, not in what she painted, but in what she chose not to paint. "I'll need 3 visits at least," she said, "and absolute honesty if she refuses me entry." He inclined his head. "You have it." She wrote his name in her ledger, in ink still wet with ochre. He watched her hand move across the page as though it carried more weight than a signed contract. When he left, the studio seemed colder for it. Later that afternoon she returned to her work, but the palette no longer looked the same. The green she had used that morning felt too dull, the shadows too flat. She reached for the canvas behind the muslin and peeled back the cloth. It was a portrait she had abandoned, a study of a man's face she had never shown, half-finished, uncertain. Now she saw something she hadn't seen before. She reached for her brush again, but this time her hand paused above the paints. She was not thinking of her brushstroke. She was remembering the exact shade of grey in Jasper Lockwood's eyes, and the way he had not looked away. The air was crisp and dry that Thursday morning, the kind of winter air that polished the windows of New York's grand buildings until they gleamed like mirrors against the pale sky. Outside the Dakota, snow flurried over Central Park West in soft spirals, gathering gently atop the wrought-iron railings and gas lanterns. Carriages passed with slow, deliberate grace, their wheels muffled by the powdered streets, and from time to time the distant clatter of hooves echoed through the hush. Inside the Dakota's west wing, in a parlor with tall ceilings and damask-covered walls, the scent of freshly boiled tea mingled with the faint perfume of lavender and old wood. The room was quiet but not empty. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting a flickering warmth upon a polished upright piano near the window. Framed sketches and still lifes hung beside family photographs, their frames mismatched but lovingly arranged. This was not the parlor of a wealthy heiress. It was the home of a woman who worked with her hands and had learned to find beauty in careful arrangements. Josephine sat at the piano bench, her fingers resting gently atop closed ivory keys, not playing. Her eyes lingered on the snow outside, the grey sweep of the park visible through lace curtains. Her mother, seated nearby in a straight-backed chair with a crocheted shawl draped across her shoulders, mended a pair of gloves in silence. And then another knock. Not the knock of a delivery boy or a client servant. This was deliberate, firm, and familiar. Before Josephine could rise, the door opened with a turn of the handle she had forgotten to lock. Jasper Lockwood stood in the threshold, dressed in a deep black overcoat lined in silk, his collar dusted faintly with snow. His gloves were in one hand, his hat in the other, and something unreadable flickered in his gaze as he looked directly at her. "Good morning," he said softly. Mrs. Carr looked up with a polite smile. "Mr. Lockwood, please come in. The kettle's still warm." But Jasper declined the tea with a courteous shake of the head. "Thank you, ma'am. If you'll permit, I'd like a word with your daughter. Alone." Josephine's mother studied him for a moment, then stood without question. "I'll be in the sewing room. Call if you need me, Joe." The door to the adjoining room closed behind her with a gentle click, and the fire popped in the silence that followed. Jasper stepped forward. He did not remove his overcoat, nor sit. Instead, he approached the piano slowly and placed something on it, a small velvet box. He did not open it. He simply let it sit there between them, like a question neither had yet dared to ask. "I thought of many ways to say this," he began, voice low but steady. "Too many, in fact. None of them seem worthy of the moment. So I'll speak plainly." Josephine remained still, though her heartbeat pulsed at the base of her throat. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, but her face revealed nothing. "I have come to ask for your hand," he said, "not because of obligation, not out of sympathy or rebellion, but because in your presence I have known more truth than in all the years I spent among financiers, family luncheons, and club parlors. Because I have come to value the silence we share more than the approval of any man in a top hat." He exhaled once. His jaw tightened. There was no flourish in him, no theatrical display, only something urgent and real, tempered by restraint. Josephine's voice, when it came, was soft. "You understand what this would mean for you?" "Yes. The invitations that would be withdrawn, the partners who would speak behind your back, the doors that would close quietly without ever announcing themselves shut." "I do." Her gaze lingered on the velvet box. Still unopened, still silent. "You say this now, in the quiet of a warm room," she said carefully. "But when the articles are printed, when the eyes turn, when my name becomes a subject at someone's dinner table, will you still speak like this? Will you still look at me as you do now?" He moved closer, slowly. Not enough to startle her, only enough for her to feel the heat that rose from his coat, the breath that clouded faintly in the air between them. "I will not stop looking," he said, "no matter how many windows frost over." Something in her trembled, but she did not let it show. Instead, she reached out, touched the velvet box with 2 fingers, and slowly opened it. Inside, resting upon dark fabric, was a ring unlike the heavy stones worn by society brides. It was delicate, a single opal surrounded by seed pearls set in pale gold. An artist's ring, a woman's ring. Josephine's breath caught. He had chosen it not to impress, but to understand, and that terrified her more than any diamond ever could. "I will consider it," she said finally, though her voice faltered at the edges. "But I must speak with my mother first." Jasper nodded. There was no triumph in his expression, only something quieter, relief laced with humility. "I will return tomorrow. You need not answer today." He took her hand gently, not in possession, not in display. He lifted it once, briefly, and pressed his lips to her knuckles with the reverence of a man who knew this was no favor being granted, but a life being shared. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him, with a softness that belied the weight of what had passed. Later that evening, Josephine sat in her mother's room, the fire low, the opal ring still in its box between them. Mrs. Carr listened in silence as her daughter recounted every word. When Josephine finished, her mother reached out and closed the box gently. "If he is the man you believe he is," she said, "then let him prove it. But don't choose him because the world disapproves. Choose him because the silence would be louder without him." The following week, a small notice appeared in the New York Times: Miss Josephine Carr to wed Mr. Jasper Lockwood of Madison Avenue. No fanfare, no social column, only those who read the fine print would catch it. But someone did. 3 days later, Josephine received a terse, handwritten note from a prominent patron. "In light of recent developments, I must withdraw my commission. I wish you well." She read it twice, folded it once, and placed it in the drawer with the rest of her unfinished sketches. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. But inside, a new season had begun, quiet, fragile, but full of breath. The afternoon light that filtered through the tall windows of Josephine Carr's studio had always been her companion, warm, patient, and honest. But that winter day, the light seemed thinner, as though something invisible had crept into the room and dimmed it. Outside, the snow had begun to melt along the cobblestones of Gramercy Park, leaving streaks of grey water that reflected the heavy clouds above. Inside, a silence as sharp as a blade hung in the air. Josephine stood before the row of storage canvases that lined the back wall of her studio. Her breath caught in her throat. One of the muslin coverings had slipped to the floor. Behind it, there was an empty space, an absence as clear as an accusation. The portrait of Senator Alcott was gone. Her fingers trembled as she touched the vacant stretch of wall, tracing the faint outline of where the frame had rested. She remembered the long hours spent capturing the senator's likeness at his wife's request. It was meant to be a gesture of devotion, a gift for their anniversary. Yet as Josephine worked, she had caught something unintentional, a reflection in the mirror behind him. The senator, leaning close to a woman whose hands rested on his sleeve, whose laughter softened the solemn air of the sitting room. The brush had caught it instinctively, like truth emerging from pigment. Josephine had meant to blur the detail later, but the final sitting was cancelled. The senator's wife had been called away to Washington, and the painting remained untouched, quietly stored among others. Until now. Her chest tightened. The missing portrait was not merely a misplaced canvas, it was a scandal waiting to breathe. The knock came minutes later, sharp, precise. The postman's rhythm. Josephine opened the door to find a plain envelope resting on the top step. No address, no seal. Only her name written in careful slanted script. She hesitated before breaking it open. Inside, on a single folded sheet, were words that made her blood run cold. The truth has its own reflection, Miss Carr. If you wish yours to remain untarnished, call off your engagement to Mr. Jasper Lockwood. Some portraits are too revealing to stay hidden. There was no signature, only a faint scent of tobacco and pressed paper, as though the writer had held it too long before sending it. She sank onto the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hand. The clock on the mantel ticked indifferently, its rhythm cruel in its calm. For the first time since Jasper's proposal, fear entered her heart. That evening she locked the studio and walked through the falling dusk to the Dakota, the letter folded tightly in her pocket. The gas lamps along the avenue glowed amber in the mist. She passed well-dressed women leaving their carriages, their laughter delicate and rehearsed, a world that seemed to glide effortlessly above hers. Jasper greeted her at the door of his aunt's apartment. He had just returned from the exchange, his expression softened by fatigue and affection. "You look pale," he said quietly. "Has something happened?" Josephine held out the envelope without a word. He read it once, then again, his eyes hardening with each line. "This is extortion," he said finally. "A coward's game." "It is also dangerous," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That painting was private. It was never meant to be seen." He moved closer, his brow furrowed. "Are you certain it's gone?" "Yes," she swallowed. "Someone entered my studio. There were no signs of forced entry, but I've noticed shadows near the steps at night. I thought it was nothing." Jasper exhaled, jaw tightening. "I'll handle it." "Handle it?" Her tone trembled, though not from anger. "Jasper, this isn't a business negotiation. This could destroy both of us." "Only if we let them." He placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was steady, but beneath it she felt tension like a coiled spring. Whoever did this expects fear. They'll get silence instead. Josephine closed her eyes briefly, drawing in the faint scent of rain from his coat. When she opened them, she saw not defiance, but the weight of a man already calculating consequences. "Your mother will hear of this," she said softly. He hesitated. That single pause told her everything. "She already has doubts, doesn't she?" He looked away. "She believes our marriage would invite scrutiny." "Scrutiny?" The word fell from her lips like a shard of glass. "She thinks the world will not forgive me for loving beyond my station." A long silence followed. Josephine turned toward the window, watching the blurred lights of carriages move along the street below. "She is right about one thing," she said. "The world never forgives a woman for standing where she wasn't invited." Jasper reached for her hand, but she withdrew it gently, not in rejection, but in sorrow. "I must think," she said, "not about us, but about what's right." He wanted to argue, to reassure, but her expression silenced him. When she left the Dakota that night, the wind had grown sharper, snowflakes brushed against her cheeks like cold tears. She walked home with her collar turned up, the letter still in her pocket, her heart divided between the need for truth and the terror of it. The following morning, word travelled faster than she thought possible. A client cancelled a sitting, citing unfortunate associations. Her laundress, who usually greeted her with warmth, avoided her eyes. Even the grocer's boy hesitated before tipping his hat. Somewhere, somehow, someone had whispered her name into the wrong ear. At noon, Mrs. Carr found her daughter standing motionless before the empty space in the studio. "Joe," she said gently, "you've not eaten." "I don't think I could," Josephine murmured. Her mother laid a hand on her arm. "I've seen this before. The world loves to test a woman's dignity." "Don't let them take yours." Josephine turned toward her, eyes glistening. "They'll ruin him, Mama. Jasper, he doesn't deserve this." "Neither do you." That night, a second note arrived, this one shorter, crueler. "You have until Sunday." 3 words, no signature. The next day, the rector from St. Thomas's sent a polite but uneasy message. Due to social sensitivities, he might need to reconsider officiating the ceremony. Josephine read it in silence, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the anonymous letters. She did not cry. Instead, she stood before her mirror, studying the reflection that had betrayed another's secret, and perhaps now her own. She saw the faint smudge of paint beneath her fingernails, the exhaustion beneath her eyes, the quiet defiance in the lift of her chin. The reflection stared back, neither saint nor sinner, but a woman who refused to vanish. That evening, she returned to her studio and lit every lamp. The light poured across the canvases, golden and relentless. She took out her sketchbook and began to draw, not the senator, not the woman in the reflection, but Jasper. Not as a man of finance or society, but as she saw him, standing near her window, light catching the grey in his eyes, strength and gentleness balanced in the same breath. Her hand trembled as she worked, but she did not stop. When at last she set down the pencil, the snow had ceased. The room was still. On the table beside her lay the letters, folded neatly, untouched. And though her future trembled like the flame of a single candle, Josephine understood what she could no longer ignore. Truth, once painted, could not be unmade, and there, in the fragile quiet of her Gramercy Park studio, she whispered to herself what she dared not yet tell Jasper Lockwood, that love, however true, was not always protection. Sometimes it was the very light that revealed every shadow. The winter sun rose pale and indifferent over New York, casting a faint gold over the slate roofs of Gramercy Park. Inside Josephine Carr's studio, the cold bit through even the thickest shawl. She had lit the stove early, though the warmth could not reach the corners of the tall room. The fire flickered weakly, its glow falling upon half-finished portraits, faces of women who smiled in oil, but not in truth. A knock at the door interrupted the stillness. It was the postboy again, cheeks flushed from the morning wind, holding a small bundle of envelopes bound with string. Josephine took them, nodded her thanks, and watched as he hurried down the steps into the grey fog. She untied the bundle with slow fingers. There were 3 letters, each with familiar crests stamped in wax, each written by patrons whose names adorned the walls of Fifth Avenue parlours. Her breath quickened as she broke the first seal. "My dear Miss Carr, I regret to inform you that the exhibition committee has decided to postpone your submission indefinitely. Circumstances beyond our control." Her eyes did not need to finish the line. The second letter was colder, signed by the wife of a railroad baron who had once praised her honesty of brush. Now that same woman wrote that her portrait would no longer be required. The third was the sharpest, a single line, unsigned. "No respectable woman allows her name to be printed beside scandal." Josephine's hand trembled, though not from surprise. The air around her seemed to tighten, pressing close. She folded each letter carefully, as though precision might keep the humiliation from seeping deeper. When her mother entered moments later, carrying a steaming pot of tea, Josephine did not speak. The older woman watched her daughter's profile in silence, the controlled composure, the chin lifted in defiance of defeat. "I see," Mrs. Carr murmured quietly, setting the pot on the table. "They've begun closing their doors." Josephine nodded once. One after another. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder. Then find another door, one they cannot lock. But Josephine did not answer. Her gaze had fallen to the far corner of the studio where the space still gaped empty, the place where the senator's portrait had once stood. That same afternoon, Jasper arrived without sending word. His expression bore the strain of sleepless nights. His gloved hands clutched his hat as though it anchored him to purpose. "I've spoken to my partners," he said, after she let him in. "They insist I must—" He stopped. He could not say the words. "Must end this," she finished softly for him. He hesitated. They believe the firm's reputation could suffer. Clients are uneasy. The stock exchange thrives on perception, not principle. Josephine turned toward the window, where sleet traced fragile veins against the glass. "And what do you believe?" "I believe perception can be rewritten," he said firmly. "If I find who's behind this." He stepped closer. The lamplight caught the grey in his eyes, the faint shadow beneath them. "The missing portrait has surfaced, Josephine, in a private gallery on Mulberry Street, an establishment known for acquiring unconventional pieces. Someone is offering it to certain collectors behind closed doors." Her heart clenched. "Then the painting wasn't stolen for money alone." "No," Jasper said. "It's leverage. There are people who trade in secrets, the kind that ruin marriages, crush rivals, and purchase silence, paintings, letters, documents. I believe the portrait has become one of their tools." Josephine's lips parted, but no sound emerged. The thought of her work, the honesty of her brush, used as currency for blackmail, struck her with both rage and shame. "I must go there," she whispered. "If they have it, I'll take it back." Jasper shook his head immediately. "You can't. That district isn't safe, not for a woman, especially not one whose name is already being passed around drawing rooms." "Then let it be passed," she said, her voice sharp as glass. "If I don't reclaim that painting myself, I'll never reclaim my name." He looked at her, truly looked, and in that moment saw not the fragile artist society believed her to be, but a woman forged by quiet endurance. "Then I'm coming with you," he said. That evening, as twilight descended over the city, they walked side by side along streets slick with ice and shadow. The gas lamps burned dim through the fog, and the distant sound of carriage wheels echoed between the brick walls of Lower Manhattan. The gallery was hidden behind a tailor's shop, marked only by a narrow door and a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the faint scent of varnish. Paintings hung close together, landscapes, portraits, even a few sketches that looked suspiciously too intimate to have been made for public eyes. A man in a burgundy waistcoat approached, his smile thin and deliberate. "Good evening," he said. "We don't often receive visitors of your refinement here." Jasper's tone was cool. "We're looking for a painting, a private commission gone astray." The man's smile deepened, revealing the kind of charm that was more knife than courtesy. "Aren't they all?" Josephine's gaze swept the room, and then she saw it. There, near the back wall, beneath the flicker of a single gas lamp, the senator's portrait. It hung tilted, as though it had been placed there hastily. The reflection in the mirror behind the man was unmistakable, the hidden embrace, the truth she had once painted without meaning to. Her breath caught. She stepped forward, but Jasper's hand closed gently around her wrist, steadying her. The man in the waistcoat followed her gaze. "Ah," he said softly, almost admiringly. "The piece has attracted quite a bit of attention. Such daring composition, realism laced with indiscretion. I can see why it's valuable." "It's stolen," Josephine said firmly. He shrugged. "Perhaps, but one might say art belongs to those who understand it best, and some understand how to use it better than others." Jasper's voice hardened. "Name your price." The man laughed quietly. "You misunderstand, Mr. Lockwood. It's not for sale. Not anymore. It's part of an arrangement, one that benefits many respectable gentlemen. I suggest you enjoy the view and forget you ever saw it." Josephine's pulse raced. "That painting bears my signature. I can destroy it with a single stroke." He turned to her, amused. "A threat? My dear Miss Carr, do you think society will pity an artist who paints other people's secrets into her work?" For a heartbeat, the room seemed to spin. The low hum of whispered conversations around them blurred into a dull roar. Then Jasper spoke, his voice cold as winter steel. "Come, Josephine. We'll find another way." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. As they stepped out into the icy night, her heart hammered beneath her coat. She could still feel the man's gaze on her back, the silent promise that this was not over. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of the park. Snowflakes had begun to fall again, soft and unhurried. Finally, Josephine stopped, turning toward him. "They will ruin me," she said quietly, "and they'll ruin you if you keep standing beside me." He stepped closer, so close that the faint warmth of his breath brushed her temple. "Let them try," he murmured. "I would rather face ruin with you than comfort without you." The words were not spoken loudly, nor meant to be remembered by anyone but her. Yet they carried more devotion than any vow she had ever heard. Josephine looked at him for a long moment, his face lit by the snow's pale glow, the tension in his jaw, the unguarded tenderness in his eyes, and something inside her steadied. "Then we'll take it back," she said. "Not for them, for us." He nodded once, the faintest smile curving at the corner of his mouth. As they walked away, the snow deepened, muting the world around them. Fifth Avenue loomed distant and glittering behind them, its doors already closing. But somewhere in the quiet dark between the lamplights, their resolve burned low and steady, like the last candle in a storm, fragile yet defiant, unwilling to die. The gaslights along Broadway flickered against the dusk, casting long, trembling shadows across the cobblestones. Josephine Carr stood beneath the eaves of a milliner's shop, watching the address scrawled on the card in her hand grow damp from the fog that curled like smoke around her shoulders. Her gloved fingers tightened over it, the paper softened from rereading. She had spent days chasing the vaguest of names, following whispers passed in studio corners and from servants who spoke only when convinced no one else was listening. What she had learned was fragmentary, but enough. The woman caught in the mirror's reflection, the one whose eyes had accidentally immortalized betrayal, had a name. Miss Lydia Hart, once a maid in the senator's household, later his mistress. And now, if the rumors were true, living quietly in a modest boarding house in Hell's Kitchen, tucked between the butcher's alley and the print shop. Josephine pulled her coat closer as she climbed the worn steps to the narrow entrance. The hallway inside smelled of boiled cabbage and coal dust. A matron with grey hair in a loose bun peered at her over spectacles from behind a chipped counter. "I'm looking for Miss Hart," Josephine said. "Lydia Hart." The woman eyed her with suspicion, her gaze drifting to the elegance of Josephine's coat and boots. "She don't get many visitors." "I won't stay long." The matron studied her a moment longer, then nodded toward the stairwell. "Second floor, first door on the right. Don't frighten her." Josephine climbed slowly, the wood creaking beneath each step. Her pulse echoed louder than her footfalls. When she reached the door, she paused, then knocked gently. A moment passed. Then the door opened just a crack. Lydia Hart stood behind it, younger than Josephine expected, no more than 26, with hair the color of burnt honey pulled into a loose braid. Her eyes were wary, wide, and ringed with shadows. She wore a plain blouse and skirt, and though her hands were calloused, her posture was careful. "I don't want trouble," Lydia said before Josephine could speak. "I'm not here to make any," Josephine replied gently. "But I believe you know what was painted into the background of that portrait. You were in the mirror." Lydia's expression didn't change, but her fingers gripped the edge of the door tighter. "I'm not going to expose you," Josephine continued, "but someone is using that painting to blackmail both me and the man I intend to marry. I believe they intend to destroy more than reputations." There was a long silence. Then Lydia opened the door fully. The room was sparse. A narrow bed, a chipped table, a shelf lined with worn books. In the far corner sat a Singer sewing machine, threaded but unused. Lydia gestured for Josephine to sit. "I remember the day he painted it," Lydia said, her voice quiet, steady. "Senator Alcott told his wife he'd sit for a portrait as a surprise, but the truth is, she was in Washington, and I was still in the house. He thought I was fetching tea when you began sketching." Josephine felt a chill. "And you walked behind him?" "I stopped for just a moment," Lydia said, looking down at her hands. "He was laughing. I touched his sleeve. I didn't know you'd caught it." Josephine nodded slowly. "I didn't realize it either, until the canvas dried. By then it was too late." Lydia sighed. "He left me after that, sent me away with hush money and a warning. But someone saw me leaving the senator's residence. I believe it was Edwin Dane." Josephine's brow furrowed. "Who is that?" "A man who wears respectability like a glove," Lydia said, bitterness lacing her voice. "He used to visit the senator often, always well-dressed, always listening. I think he collects secrets the way others collect coins." Josephine's chest tightened. She had heard the name before, in galleries, at quiet luncheons, always spoken with admiration by men who never said what exactly Dane did for a living. "He found me again," Lydia continued, "offered me protection. Said he could keep my name clean if I handed over any letters, any knowledge of the senator's indiscretions. I refused. He laughed, said he'd find another way to use what I already gave." Josephine stood, the weight of understanding descending fully now. "He's behind the gallery," Lydia nodded. "He's behind more than that. He funds exhibitions, campaigns, social clubs. No one questions him because he never speaks too loudly." Josephine turned toward the window. Below, the city blurred into shades of grey. 1,000 lives moving beneath the surface, none suspecting how much power could rest in a single man's knowledge of other people's shame. "I'm sorry you were caught in this," Josephine said after a moment. "I never meant to paint you into a battlefield." Lydia rose. Her voice was steady. "You painted the truth. The shame isn't yours." Josephine looked at her. "Would you be willing to say that to someone else, in confidence?" Lydia hesitated. "Who?" Josephine took a breath. "The senator's wife." The meeting was arranged 2 days later. In a quiet corner of the Union Club's winter garden, shielded by ivy walls and the discreet clink of crystal, Josephine sat opposite Mrs. Eleanor Alcott. A woman of poise and iron, Eleanor wore a sable-trimmed cloak and gloves stitched in Florence. Her posture never wavered, and her expression bore the calm of someone who had seen worse storms than scandal. "I know who the woman is," Eleanor said before Josephine could begin. "I knew the moment I saw the painting." Josephine's breath caught. "I commissioned it because I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that a portrait might soften what time had made harsh," Eleanor continued. "But when I saw what was reflected, I knew my marriage was beyond saving. I kept the painting hidden, hoping it might someday offer me leverage if needed." "You never intended to expose him?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not unless he tried to destroy me first. We may live in gilded homes, Miss Carr, but the walls are thin. A wife has little recourse if a husband claims madness or cruelty or disloyalty. That painting was my only shield." Josephine reached into her bag. Inside, wrapped in silk, was the original canvas. The one displayed at the gallery had been a duplicate, a copy painted by another hand, lacking the delicate brushwork, the truth. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "I'm offering it to you," Josephine said, her voice low, "but I need your help. Edwin Dane is using it to ruin lives, mine, Lydia Hart's, perhaps others. You have power, connections, discretion. I ask for none of it publicly, but I need it now." Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she took the canvas and ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the frame. "You are braver than most women I know," she said, "and far more honest than the men who surround us. Very well, I will help." Their eyes met, not in gratitude nor in victory, but in understanding. Later that evening, Josephine returned to her studio. The snow had begun again, fine as sifted sugar. She lit the stove and sat by the window, her hands still trembling from all that had been said, all that had been risked. She reached for her sketchbook and began a new portrait, not of Eleanor, not of Lydia, but of a woman standing in half-shadow, holding a canvas in one hand and a broken silence in the other. She did not need to sign it. The truth at last had its own signature, and it had begun to answer back. The first Thursday of March arrived with a hush. The streets of Gramercy Park were coated in a damp veil of melting snow, the kind that clung to window panes like ghosts reluctant to leave. The city exhaled with grey skies and restless whispers, and beneath those murmurs Josephine Carr prepared for war, not with weapons or headlines, but with pencils, sketches, and truth. Her studio had been swept clean, its canvases dusted, the windows unlatched to allow in the early afternoon light. She had arranged the room with the precision of a woman setting a stage, not for applause, but for clarity. Unfinished drawings lined the long oak table, the paper edges pinned with smooth river stones. She had unrolled the ledgers, the dates of commissions, the annotations in her careful hand. And on the easel, flanked by draped curtains, rested the centerpiece, her own study of the missing painting, imperfect, shadowed, but unmistakably hers. Only 5 chairs had been set, no more than that. The names on the invitations had been selected with solemn purpose, an editor with a reputation for moral reform, a minor collector with debts and a conscience, a discreet lawyer versed in art theft, a society widow with old grudges and new alliances, and, standing apart from them all, Jasper Lockwood. He arrived precisely at the hour promised, his overcoat damp at the shoulders, his gaze steady. He removed his gloves slowly, as though preparing to face not the weather, but the weight of what they were about to reveal. "I thought you might change your mind," Josephine said softly as he stepped inside. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth tilting not into a smile, but into a kind of reverent awe. There was never a chance of that. She motioned toward the easel. "Everything is here. Sketches, annotations, letters from Mrs. Alcott confirming the timeline. I've laid it out for them to follow, without noise, without shame." He studied the display, his jaw tight. "You've built a courtroom out of brushstrokes." "I've built a defense," she replied, lifting her chin, "before they write my sentence for me." When the guests arrived, they entered quietly, one by one, their footsteps softened by the thick rug that muffled every movement. No one spoke at first. They examined the pieces, the drawings, the dates. The collector cleared his throat nervously. The editor made brief notes in a worn leather pad. The widow nodded with a flicker of admiration Josephine had not expected. When at last she spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate. She told the story, not in emotion, but in sequence. The senator, the portrait, the mirror, the reflection, the theft, the blackmail, Lydia, Mrs. Alcott, Edwin Dane, each thread laid before them not as plea, but as evidence. "I am not asking for exoneration," she said, "only for acknowledgement. That this was not seduction but circumstance, not manipulation but misused art." Silence followed. Then the lawyer, a stooped man with thoughtful eyes, stepped forward. "I believe your record," he said. "But you understand. Those behind this do not fear artists, they fear exposure." "I'm counting on that," she replied, "which is why I've invited you all here." One by one the others offered their voices, not of overwhelming support, but of understanding, of reluctant alliance. In a city ruled by appearances, even an inch of truth could be a weapon. When they left, dusk had begun its slow descent. Josephine stood at the window, watching the lamplighter strike each post along the avenue. Behind her, Jasper remained, still by the easel. "You were brilliant," he said quietly. She turned, exhaustion and gratitude battling in her eyes. "I was terrified, which is why it mattered." She allowed herself a single breath of closeness, her hand resting briefly on the side of his coat, her gaze lingering near his collarbone, not daring to rise to his eyes. It was not an embrace, but it held more weight than any they had shared. That night, the quiet did not last. At 11 o'clock, Jasper was summoned to his uncle's residence near Washington Square. The Lockwood brownstone was a fortress of dark marble and ancestral disdain. Inside, the drawing room was ablaze with firelight and fury. Jasper Lockwood Sr. stood near the hearth, silver-haired and severe, holding a tumbler of scotch like a scepter. "You've humiliated this family," he said without preamble. "You consort with scandal, defend a woman who entraps politicians, and now you're opening our name to disgrace." Jasper did not flinch. "She has done nothing but tell the truth. You should be grateful someone finally is." "You think truth pays dividends?" his uncle barked. "Your firm survives because men trust your name. You think they will when it is printed beside hers in the gossip pages?" "If those men are so fragile," Jasper said coolly, "perhaps they're not worth doing business with." His uncle's face hardened. "Withdraw from this. End the engagement, publicly, and you will retain your inheritance, your seat, your clients. Refuse, and you will be cast out." The silence stretched. The fire cracked. Outside, a dog howled in the distance. Jasper rose. "Then I suggest you write me out of your will before breakfast." He left, without waiting for reply. At dawn, Josephine woke to a knock at her studio door. She pulled her shawl tighter and opened it, expecting Jasper. Instead, a young messenger thrust a newspaper into her hand. "Evening Press," he muttered. "Page 3. She read it standing by the window, her lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. The article was unsigned, but the voice behind it was sharp and familiar. It spoke of artists who lure their subjects with flattery only to immortalize their shame. It hinted at seductive postures disguised as technique, and an engagement forged not in love, but manipulation. It described her as a woman of ambition cloaked in canvas. No name, but all knew who it meant. Josephine dropped the paper as if it had burned her. That afternoon, a neighbor avoided her on the stairs. A child pointed. The baker she visited weekly offered a curt nod, nothing more. She returned to her studio and sat in silence. Her sketches lay where she had left them. The light had shifted. The shadows were longer. She picked up a brush and stared at the canvas before her. Then slowly she dipped the bristles in dark pigment, not to obscure, but to define. A figure began to emerge, one drawn not in flattery or fear, but with lines of grief and resilience. A woman with a lifted chin and tired eyes. A woman facing a storm, not with armor but with open hands. Behind her the shadows deepened, but they were her own, and she no longer feared them. The sky over Manhattan had turned the color of tarnished silver by the time Jasper Lockwood stepped onto the marble steps of the Union League Club. Rain laced the air with the bitter scent of wet stone and coal smoke. He was expected. The letter had been curt, an invitation without signature, delivered by hand to his office just before noon. The words were few, but the implication unmistakable. Come alone, no attorneys, no scenes. The doorman ushered him in with a nod that carried neither warmth nor surprise. Inside, the hall glowed with gaslight and the hushed arrogance of private power. Mahogany paneling, crystal sconces, and the muted shuffle of gentlemen who had never once felt the cold weight of ruin. Jasper passed them all without a word, the soles of his boots silent on the carpeted stairs. He found Edwin Dane seated in the reading room, sipping cognac as though it were communion. Dressed in dove-grey wool, his gloves resting on the arm of the chair, Dane looked every inch the patron of quiet corruption. His smile, when he glanced up, was a precise, polished thing. "You came," he said mildly. "I admire loyalty, even when it's misplaced." Jasper remained standing. "You sent the article to the press." "I merely encouraged a narrative that was already taking root," Dane replied, swirling the glass in his hand. "But that's not why you're here." "Then say it." Dane leaned back. You're still young enough to salvage what's left of your family's standing. Break the engagement, publicly. Dismiss Miss Carr's name from your lips, and I will ensure the rumors fade. Your reputation, your firm, your fortune, all intact. Or refuse, and watch your name rot in the exchange. Jasper's jaw flexed. You expect me to trade a woman's dignity for the illusion of decorum? Dane raised a brow. You trade every day, Lockwood. Stocks, futures, risk. This is no different. Jasper took a slow step forward. You think you're the puppeteer, but you forget something essential. Puppeteers don't appear on stage, and I'm already standing in the light. He turned without waiting for a response. Dane's voice followed him, calm and unshaken. Then enjoy the applause, Mr. Lockwood. It will be brief. While Jasper faced threats draped in velvet, Josephine Carr sat at her drafting table, pen in hand, staring at a blank page. The morning had brought her an envelope sealed in red wax. No name, but the contents spoke louder than any signature. A single proposition, carefully worded. If you wish to preserve Mr. Lockwood's name and future, surrender all original sketches relating to the Alcott portrait and sign the enclosed letter of admission. You will be paid for your cooperation. Silence will be honored. No one else need suffer. The letter was short, a confession forged in precise language that she had encouraged her sitters to pose suggestively, that the scandal had been orchestrated for notoriety, that her engagement was a calculated attempt to elevate her social station. A lie wearing the skin of truth. The coin purse attached was heavy, more than most of her commissions had ever paid. Josephine placed it aside and folded her hands in her lap. Her mother was in the adjoining room, unaware. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, tapping against the glass, like a question with no polite answer. She could end it all. Protect Jasper. Retreat into silence. Let the storm pass. Or she could speak. That afternoon, she walked through the city with her shawl drawn close, her steps steady. She passed storefronts that no longer greeted her, neighbors who turned aside, a child who whispered her name behind a gloved hand. She reached the editorial office of the Herald Tribune, a building not as grand as others, but lit with a different fire, one that came from conviction, not kerosene. He was waiting for her there, the man she had written to, Charles Whitmore, editor of the Reform column. A man known for printing truths no one else dared, for championing working women, immigrant laundresses, laborers accused without trial. A man who had once written a scathing rebuttal of the Alcott Railroad monopoly and lived to see his readership double. He stood when she entered, bowing slightly. "Miss Carr," he said, "your letter intrigued me." "I don't need vindication," she said, removing her gloves. "I need truth, printed not as spectacle, but as understanding." He studied her. "Do you wish to name names?" "No," she said, "only mechanisms, patterns, the quiet hands behind public destruction. I want to write about how women are turned into cautionary tales, about how art can be twisted into scandal without ever changing the pigment." He nodded slowly. "You won't be paid much." "I'm not here for coin. You'll need a pseudonym." "I already have one," she said. "E.C. Loring, my mother's name before she married." He smiled at that. "Then welcome to the paper, Miss Loring. Let's begin." When she left, the rain had ceased. The air smelled of ink and iron. That night, Josephine returned to her studio and wrapped the original portrait in linen. She boxed it, sealed it, and addressed it not to Dane, but to Eleanor Alcott. Alongside it, she placed a letter of her own. "This painting has cost more than it was ever worth. Let it now serve its original purpose, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. You know what you must do. I trust you'll do it with dignity." She gave the box to a trusted courier at dawn. Then she sat by her window, the morning light brushing her face like forgiveness. Her fingers trembled as she picked up her pencil. A new page, a new voice. Across the city, Jasper read the latest market briefs, his brow furrowed. But when a boy arrived with a slip of newsprint, folded into fourths, his hands stilled. The headline read, Portraits of Power, How Silence Becomes Currency, by E.C. Loring. He read every word, not a name mentioned. No vengeance, only clarity. Each paragraph a brushstroke of resistance, each sentence a refusal to disappear. He folded the paper and pressed it once against his lips. That evening, he arrived at Josephine's door. She opened it slowly, unsure of what he had come to say. He looked at her a moment before speaking. "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me that dignity cannot be purchased, and that silence isn't always grace." She stepped back, allowing him into the lamplight. Their eyes met, full of unspoken ache and tempered hope. "I gave away the painting," she said, "but I kept my voice." He reached for her hand, not as reassurance, but as recognition. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And in the quiet of that evening, their silence spoke of something stronger than triumph, something neither scandal nor blackmail could touch. The calm after fire, the stillness of truth, the echo of two people who refused to disappear. The clamour of Lower Broadway had taken on a new timbre, no longer the brazen confidence of unchecked fortune, but a kind of breathless watchfulness, as if the very cobblestones had begun to tremble beneath the weight of something unspoken. Inside the thick brick walls of Lockwood and Alcott Financial, the air was heavier than usual, the polished brass fixtures and mahogany desks doing little to disguise the unease that moved through the building, like a draught no one could name aloud. Jasper Lockwood stood in the firm's central office, the ledgers spread before him in full view. His overcoat lay folded on a chair, his sleeves rolled to his forearms, ink staining his cuffs. His associates, some young, some seasoned, most pale, watched as he addressed a small gathering of select clients and board members. The room was quiet, except for the scratching of pens and the occasional intake of breath. "These are the numbers," he said simply. "No redirection, no protective layering, no hidden entries." An older man with a gold watch chain cleared his throat. "You understand the implication, Lockwood. If this firm is tied to Senator Alcott's holdings, and there's overlap in any falsified transactions, then better we know it now," Jasper said calmly, "and face it head-on." Another voice from the back, quieter. "You would burn the scaffolding rather than pretend the rot isn't there." "I would rather rebuild than rot quietly," Jasper replied. The silence that followed was tense, but beneath it, respect. Cautious, newly born, but real. Outside, word had already begun to spread. The press had caught the scent of something more than gossip, truth measured in margins and misled investors, in railroad schemes and shadow acquisitions. With each hour, new names were whispered. The combine was unraveling not from scandal, but from arithmetic. By nightfall, Senator Alcott's resignation reached the city in the form of a telegram posted to every major editorial desk. "Effective immediately, I withdraw from all business and public responsibilities for reasons of health and personal reflection." No name was mentioned, but the portrait, the true portrait, had already spoken louder than ink. In a quiet corner office, Jasper leaned against the window frame, his shirt collar loosened, a single curl fallen across his brow. The skyline was beginning to glow with gaslight and dusk. Behind him, a junior clerk lingered nervously near the door. "There's also news about Mr. Dane, sir. He's gone. Cleared his accounts. Took a train north yesterday." Jasper nodded slowly. "Let him run." But even as he said it, he knew the man was not fleeing justice, only the light of exposure. The city would welcome him again in another name, another tailored suit. But for now, his grip had loosened, and that, at least, was something. The following morning, Josephine Carr sat at her mother's kitchen table, the smell of warm bread and old varnish filling the small apartment. The newspaper lay open beside her tea, a half-smile playing at the corners of her lips. Miss E.C. Loring's latest column continues to stir thoughtful discourse in artistic and political circles, a voice of clarity in an era of performance, courageous, pointed, and exquisitely rendered. Her mother passed her a folded envelope with a raised eyebrow. This came by messenger, no return address. Josephine unfolded it with care. Inside was a card, heavy paper, the ink precise but unsigned. A single pressed violet lay flat against the page. There were no words, none needed. She closed the card gently and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That afternoon, 3 exhibition invitations arrived by post. One from the Columbia Women's Art Society, another from the Rothschild Gallery uptown, and one, more surprising, from a patron who had once openly denounced her work. Josephine smiled softly, then slid them into a drawer and returned to her canvas. She did not want redemption from them. She wanted her hands clean, her voice steady, her silence hers alone to wield. Just before dusk, the bell above the studio door chimed softly. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. Jasper stood in the threshold, still in his rain-dark coat, his boots lightly dusted with the city's late March grime. In his hand, 2 cups of coffee in plain paper. "No fanfare?" she asked. "I left my herald outside," he replied, stepping in with a grin. He was too loud. She accepted the coffee, the warmth seeping into her palms. They stood facing one another, the only sound between them the slow, ticking rhythm of the regulator clock above the mantel. "How bad was it?" she asked quietly. "Worse than expected," he said, "but less than feared. The firm will recover. The clients who stayed have teeth, and the others, well, they were never meant to build anything real." She nodded, then looked down at her cup. "And your uncle?" He shrugged. "Gone silent, which is an improvement. And your mother?" He reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope, pressed, violet and all. "She sent it by hand, no signature. But I know her script, and I know her violets." Josephine held the flower between her fingers. A truce, a concession. He looked at her then, not with triumph, but with the quiet awe of a man who had seen the edge of loss and returned with only what mattered. "I've asked you before," he said. "In music rooms and under gaslight. I've spoken with certainty and with urgency, but this time I ask, not in hope, but in truth." She turned fully toward him, the last streak of sunset brushing the back of her studio in amber. Her apron was stained with paint, her cheeks flushed from the stove, and her hair pinned with only half success. There was no gallery applause, no witnesses in pearls, only this moment. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not to silence them, not to save me, but because the world will always speak, and I want to choose the only voice that matters." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears but with something deeper, recognition, rest. "Yes," she said, her voice a breath, "but only if you promise me coffee and no ceremony." "No ceremony," he teased. "Not even a ribbon." She stepped closer, touching her hand lightly to his chest. "Just this." He bent forward, forehead to hers, the smell of rain still clinging to his collar. And there, in the center of her studio, surrounded by brushes, silence, and the slow fade of scandal, they sealed their promise not with vows, but with presence. No altar, no procession. Only 2 hands, 2 voices, and a shared quietness that would no longer belong to the world. Snow had returned to New York like a blessing whispered under breath, soft, hushed, and without pretense. Flakes drifted through the morning air in slow descent, dissolving upon the broad shoulders of the Dakota's limestone facade and clinging gently to the iron balconies. The city moved at half-pace beneath the weight of the storm, and yet, within the west wing of the grand building, something far quieter stirred. In the music room, the chairs had been arranged not by rank nor wealth, but by love and loyalty. No aisle flanked by marble urns, no grand floral arrangements brought in from Fifth Avenue hothouses. Just a circle of chairs, modest, well-polished, gathered close beneath a golden chandelier that flickered with gaslight, casting warm shadows along the mouldings and painted ceiling. Josephine Carr stood before the window, her back to the room, her reflection barely visible in the pane that trembled with frost. She wore a gown of bronze silk, faded at the hem, but luminous in the lamplight, stitched by her own hands in long hours when her thoughts had been too heavy for painting. Her gloves, hand-repaired at the fingertips, were a gift from her mother years ago, softened by time and touch. Her hair was drawn back in a simple knot, adorned with a single pin of jet and pearl. She breathed slowly, not to calm her nerves, but to acknowledge them. This was not fear, this was clarity. There would be no choir, no whispered pageantry, only the moment, and the man who had chosen to stand beside her when the world had turned its face. Mrs. Carr adjusted the folds of Josephine's gown with careful fingers, her eyes glassy with something she would not name. She leaned in, close enough that only her daughter could hear. "You look like your grandmother," she said softly, "before the war. Before everything changed." Josephine smiled faintly. "Is that a compliment?" She was brave. Quietly, "You carry that in you." A knock at the archway announced the arrival of the others. No fanfare. Only the low murmur of conversation as the guests entered. Eleanor Alcott, widow now, wore deep garnet and a hat veiled with fine netting. Her gloved hands were folded neatly over a small book of poetry. She nodded to Josephine as she entered, offering a look that was not quite a smile, but far more than courtesy. Behind her, Charles Whitmore, editor and occasional firebrand, settled into a chair near the piano. He carried no notebook today, only a folded news clipping in his coat pocket, one of Josephine's columns, published under the name E. C. Loring. Jasper Lockwood's aunt, regal in her simplicity, sat nearest the front, her cane balanced across her lap, her expression one of unwavering affection. And then, at last, Mrs. Carr took her seat, hands folded like a prayer that had already been answered. The room stilled, and then Jasper entered. No orchestra could have matched the quiet power of his presence. He wore a grey suit, pressed and modest, with a dark tie, and his collar starched just enough to hold his posture high. His coat he had left at the door, and his boots, though polished, bore the marks of the slush and grit he had walked through that morning. In his eyes, clear, unwavering, there was no performative joy, only reverence. He crossed the room to Josephine without hesitation. They faced each other in the golden half-light, her gloved hands resting gently in his. The minister, a woman with salt-grey hair and eyes like warm smoke, spoke only a few lines that felt more like breath than pronouncement. "No vows memorized," she said. "No borrowed scripture, only this. Do you choose each other?" Jasper looked into Josephine's eyes. "I choose you." Josephine, her lips parted only slightly, her breath misting between them, whispered, "And I, you." The minister stepped back. "Then let what you've chosen become what you build. Let it be steady, let it be kind." At the piano, a woman Josephine had once painted, an aging soprano from the Upper West Side whose portrait still hung above her mantel, played the opening notes of Schumann's Träumerei. The melody wound through the room like ribbon, gentle, melancholic, true. No kiss was demanded, no ovation followed. Instead, they stood in stillness, hand in hand, their foreheads resting together as if to say, "We begin here and nowhere else." Afterward, no carriages waited, no orchestra played. They walked. Past the Dakota's grand staircase, past the polished wood of the vestibule, and out into the snow. The city greeted them with silence. Josephine and Jasper crossed the avenue on foot, the wind curling around their coats, the snow brushing their shoulders like blessings. They turned down 20th Street and made their way toward Gramercy Park. The streets, softened by weather and late hour, seemed emptied of judgment, emptied of watching. It was not a wedding march, it was not triumph. It was something deeper, a procession of quiet defiance, of two people refusing to be rewritten, their footsteps crunched over the snow, muffled by slush. A gaslight flickered as they passed. Somewhere far off, a carriage wheel skidded, a horse snorted into the wind. But within that moment, there was only them. They reached the gate of the park, still locked for the season, the key resting in Josephine's coat pocket. She unlocked it and stepped inside. Snow clung to the hedges and statues, to the bare-limbed trees and wrought-iron benches. The city looked away. The world allowed them this, for once. They sat on a bench, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand closing over hers with gentle certainty. No words passed between them. None were needed. She looked up once, studying the slope of his jaw, the wind-roughed curve of his cheek. He turned to her, his breath visible in the lamplight, his eyes the same steel grey that had first stopped her hand mid-brushstroke. He smiled, not broadly, just enough, and she knew. The noise of the world had not ceased. It never would. But they had carved out something still, something that did not ask for permission to exist. Love not in performance, but in presence. And in the snow-silenced heart of Gramercy, their story stepped into its next breath, unadorned, unashamed, and entirely their own. The morning sun filtered through the upper panes of the studio's tall windows, casting ribbons of gold across the wooden floor and bathing the easels in a warmth that felt almost indulgent. Dust motes spun lazily through the air, untouched by haste or expectation. There was no crowd waiting beyond the door, no brass plaque announcing the event. Only those who knew to come came, and that was exactly as Josephine Carr intended. It had been 4 months since the ceremony in the music room. 4 months of silence where noise had once ruled. 4 months of walking past headlines that now bypassed her name, of dinners shared with no preamble, of quiet returns to a city that no longer watched her every breath. The scandal had faded, not vanquished, but outlived. What remained was quieter, more enduring. Inside her studio, the walls bore new canvases, not the polished, pale likenesses society once demanded, but bolder truths, unvarnished expressions, gazes that met the viewer with frankness instead of demureness, faces lined with choice, not shame. At the far end of the room, veiled by a muslin sheet, stood 2 canvases awaiting their unveiling. Josephine adjusted the folds of her skirt and smoothed the linen bodice of her cream-coloured dress. It bore no embellishment save a thin cord of blue ribbon at the waist. She wore no corset, no gloves. Her hair, pinned loosely, held a single silver comb Jasper had given her one morning without ceremony, saying only, "It looks like something you would have found yourself." The guests arrived in quiet clusters. Eleanor Alcott first, glancing around the studio with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to public space, but still searching for privacy within it. She was followed by Charles Whitmore, now a regular visitor, who brought with him a bound proof of her latest essay series. Its title, The Eye That Waits, had taken root in readers' hearts, a whisper against the thunder of manufactured opinion. Then came women Josephine did not know well, patrons, teachers, widows, daughters, drawn not by fame but by feeling. They stood with their hands clasped or arms folded, eyes moving slowly over each brushstroke. Some wept, others remained still. And finally, Jasper arrived. He wore no tie, just an open-necked shirt beneath his dark waistcoat, sleeves rolled once, his boots damp from walking rather than polished for display. His eyes searched the room briefly until they found her, and then they did not stray again. Josephine stepped forward. With a firm, measured gesture, she pulled the sheet from the first canvas. Gasps rose softly. It was her. But not the Josephine of society portraits. No blushed cheeks, no softened lighting. This was a self-portrait forged in hours of raw honesty. She stood slightly turned, as if caught mid-thought, her fingers still stained with paint, her expression both tired and luminous. Behind her, instead of a grand interior, was the soft, recognizable wall of her studio, textured, imperfect, real, and beside it she unveiled the second, Jasper, unfinished. A study in tension, he was captured in a moment of reflection, seated with one hand resting on a folded newspaper, the other near his jaw, eyes lost somewhere off canvas. The brushstrokes ended mid-chest, the colour just beginning to fill his cravat. The background faded into bare canvas, as if the world around him was still forming. The room held its breath. Then someone whispered, a dialogue, in light. And that was what it was, a conversation across silence. An admission of presence and process, of being seen not in conclusion, but in becoming. Josephine let the viewers wander. She did not perform explanations. She had offered truth in pigment and composition. That was enough. Later, once the guests had thinned, she stepped outside for air. The sun had dipped behind the rooftops, casting the narrow alley behind the studio in amber shadow. The wind tugged at the hem of her skirt. From within, she heard the low hum of conversation, but it no longer pulled at her nerves. Jasper joined her, his coat draped over one arm. He stood beside her without speaking. I thought I would feel more, she said finally. He looked at her. You feel steady? She nodded. Yes. He offered her his arm, and they walked. Not toward any appointment or supper engagement, but simply in the direction the light moved. The fellowship the senator's wife had promised now bore Josephine's name. Young women, unmarried, uncategorized, were painting without apology in the same neighborhoods where she had once asked for permission. The editor continued to publish her essays, sometimes paired with sketches. Under the name E.C. Loring, she had become not only a painter, but a voice that echoed beyond canvas. And Jasper, his firm had shrunk, but what remained was honest. Clients stayed because he looked them in the eye, because he told them what no one else would. He took on fewer accounts, but more responsibility. They no longer dined at Delmonico's. They no longer received notes from society matrons or invitations to winter balls. But they had other rituals. Coffee made carefully on the small stove near the window. Letters opened and read aloud, then answered slowly in pencil. Newspapers spread between them, read out of order. The quiet tick of the studio clock. The scratch of graphite on paper. The stillness of two people drawing. Not always the same thing, not always in silence, but drawing nonetheless, again and again toward each other. One morning she found a single sheet on her easel. Not signed, not titled. Just a sketch of two hands, hers and his, reaching, not touching, but close. She turned and found him watching. You never finish it, she said. I like it as it is. She smiled. So do I. And in that shared space where nothing more was asked, where nothing needed to be proven, their story continued, not as an echo of what had been denied them, but as a life quietly, defiantly drawn together. The winter of 1899 arrived not with fury, but with a quiet dignity, blanketing the iron fences of Gramercy Park in a soft white hush. Icicles hung like glass pendants from the gas lamps, and children's laughter echoed faintly through the winding paths beneath the bare elms. The city, ever in motion, had grown taller, louder, more electric, but some corners still belonged to time. Inside the familiar studio, the scent of oil and linseed lingered in the air. The old easel stood in its usual place, now burnished by years of use. On a nearby table, a pair of tiny wool mittens lay beside a half-drunk cup of coffee, still steaming. Josephine stood at the window, arms crossed loosely over her shawl, her eyes following two figures outside. Jasper, holding the hand of their daughter, Ruth, nearly 3, who was pointing with fascination at the snowflakes melting on her mitten. He bent to listen to her earnest questions and answered each with the gravity one reserves for queens and dreamers. Motherhood had come quietly, without fanfare. There had been no newspaper birth announcement, no family heirlooms passed down, no grand nursery designed in blue or pink. But Ruth had been cradled in love from the moment Josephine whispered her name into the stillness of that first night. The studio had evolved. A second room now served as a gallery open twice a month to the public, mostly women, though a few men came too, professors, journalists, the occasional senator's daughter. Her series of essays, The Eye That Waits, had been bound into a single volume, translated into French and German and studied in quiet rooms by women who longed to be heard. Josephine no longer painted society portraits. Her name was no longer whispered with scandal but spoken with admiration, sometimes even reverence, yet she remained untouched by grandeur. She dressed as she always had, simply, beautifully, unassumingly. She still re-sewed the buttons on her gloves and tied her daughter's boots with paint-stained hands. Jasper's brokerage had weathered storms. He had never been forgiven by some in his class, but time had lent him an odd sort of respect. The men who once mocked him now came to him quietly for counsel, no longer expecting flattery, but craving his rare ability to speak plainly. His uncle had died 2 years prior, bitter, alone, and unread. His mother sent no further letters, but Ruth received pressed violets each spring in the post. She called them her quiet flowers. As for those who had tried to silence Josephine, the gallery owners, the patrons who withdrew, the blackmailer who vanished into a scandal of his own, none had left a mark deeper than a smudge in the city's memory. Power shifted, as it always did, but Josephine had outlasted them not through retaliation, but through presence, through truth, through staying. And so, on this 4th winter, since the day they stood beneath gaslight and exchanged their quiet vows, Josephine moved from the window and lit the stove. Ruth would be cold soon, and Jasper would bring her in with snowflakes in her curls and questions in her voice. She laid out a sheet of parchment on the table and dipped her pen. Today, my daughter asked if snow makes the world quiet, or if the world was always quiet, and we just forgot to listen. She smiled. Yes, the world had grown noisier, faster. But here, in this little corner of Manhattan, time still bowed to love, to pencils and paper, to hands clasped over morning coffee. The battles had been real, the wounds lasting. But what remained was stronger than scandal, stronger than silence. It was legacy, not carved in marble, not etched into ledgers, but drawn each day in the soft light of a studio where love had taken root and refused to fade. And as the first stars appeared above the city and laughter filled the stairwell once more, Josephine Carr Lockwood folded her letter, kissed her daughter's cold cheek, and returned to her canvas. Not to escape the world, but to bear witness to it. Always. What a journey. The portrait in the Dakota isn't just a love story. It's a quiet revolution. It reminds us that truth spoken softly can still echo through the tallest walls, that dignity is louder than applause, and that love, real, enduring love, is not built on spectacle, but on shared mornings, mutual respect, and the courage to stay when silence would be easier. Josephine and Jasper taught us that legacy isn't what the world gives you. It's what you choose to leave behind. Not power, not perfection, but presence, integrity. And above all, love that survives, not because it's easy, but because it is chosen again and again, even when the world turns away. If this story moved you, made you pause, made you feel seen, leave us a comment below. We'd love to know what part stayed with you the longest. And if you read all the way to the very end, type the word resilience in the comments. That way, we'll know you stood with Josephine and Jasper all the way to that final cup of coffee. If you'd like to support the team that brings these timeless stories to life, consider leaving a super thanks with whatever amount feels right for you. Every bit goes toward continuing to craft these narratives with the care, research, and heart they deserve. And if you're not able to support financially, know this: just by sharing this video with a friend, you're helping more people discover these stories that honor courage, tenderness, and second chances. Before you go, make sure to explore the other historical love stories we've linked for you in the cards. If you loved this tale, we promise you'll fall in love all over again. Thank you, from the very depths of our storytelling hearts.